To Trekkies, the Prime Directive is as familiar as Order 66 is to Star Wars fans. But what is this non-interference policy really for? Does it actually achieve its lofty goals, or is it just an impossible ideal? And how does Starfleet square don't interfere with boldly go? That's what we're digging into today. Its origins, on-screen evolution, 4 categories of violations, and the directive's biggest blind spot. If you're into Trek ethics, politics, religion, and culture, you're in the right place. So join me as we delve into these questions and more as we explore the Prime Directive. Is it Star Trek's most impossible rule? In terms of structure, this presentation will explore the Prime Directive, beginning with its origins in the canon and tracing its evolution on screen. We'll examine the need for such a directive and then categorize types of Prime Directive violations based on their consequences on religion, politics, and culture. Finally, we'll address the directive's biggest blind spot before concluding with my overall thoughts and inviting yours. If you find this discussion engaging, please like and subscribe. It truly helps the channel. Alright, let's start with an introduction to the Prime Directive. Gene Roddenberry and Gene L. Kuhn, a veteran Trek writer, conceived of the Prime Directive in response to the destruction of the Vietnam War. Roddenberry, a World War II veteran and former police officer, had witnessed enough violence in his lifetime. In 1988, he famously stated, "The strength of a civilization is not measured by its ability to fight wars, but rather by its ability to prevent them." Roddenberry's humanist ethos was rooted in nonviolence, and this belief is crystallized in the Prime Directive. But what exactly is the Prime Directive, and when did it originate? Also known as General Order 1, the concept was first introduced in the original series Season 1 episode Return of the Archons, written by Boris Sobelman from a story by Roddenberry himself. Released on February 9, 1967, this episode aired during a critical escalation of the violence in the Vietnam War. 3 years after the Gulf of Tonkin incident and 2 years after the landing of U.S. Marines, the episode premiered after nearly 8,700 U.S. forces had already died fighting in Vietnam. This episode gives us the origins and the spirit of the non-intervention policy and the wiggle room captains use out in the final frontier. In this episode, the Enterprise investigates the disappearance of the Archon, a Federation ship lost a century ago. They discover a seemingly brainwashed, overly mellow society. However, this tranquility is deceptive. On the landing party's arrival, the planet enters a 12-hour period of intense violence, leaving the Starfleet crew completely confused. When the inhabitants realize Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and the rest of the landing party didn't participate in the purge, they deem them, quote, not of the body, and attempt to, quote, absorb them into their society. Kirk uses his magical powers of confusion to escape. Through their time on the planet, they learn that the Archon's crew reached the planet with many casualties. The survivors were absorbed into the body or the community. It's revealed that Landru is a supercomputer created 6,000 years ago by the original Landru. Programmed to protect Beta 3 society, the computer took its directive a little too literally, dominating the entire population. Though seemingly content, the Betans lack creativity and a spark of life, and for this, Kirk believes the computer must be destroyed. When Kirk insists on destroying the computer, Spock cites the Prime Directive of non-interference, noting that destroying the computer would violate the directive. Kirk counters that the Prime Directive applies only to living, growing cultures, arguing that Beta 3's culture is in arrested development due to Landru. Kirk and Spock then outlogic the computer, causing its explosion. The people of Beta 3 are left to their own devices after this. The ending, it's unsettling. Kirk leaves a culture which has been unaccustomed to independent thought for generations to suddenly govern itself. Which they can't, or won't. Over a century after Kirk's intervention, the USS Cerritos finds Beta 3 still worshipping Landru, a consequence of the power vacuum Kirk left behind. Oh wow, changing political structures and then leaving people without leadership leads to problems? Say it ain't so! Iraq War. Sorry, guys. Little tickle there. The Cerritos crew reiterates Kirk's message of not being controlled by a computer, but the outcome for the Batons and their worship of this all-powerful computer remains unknown. Captain Freeman expresses frustration at the prevalence of Kirk-era Prime Directive violations, emphasizing the Federation's need for follow-up on such incidents much sooner. This first example of the Prime Directive in practice reveals two key takeaways about the Order as originally envisioned. First, it fundamentally emphasized non-interference, allowing cultures to evolve autonomously without external influence, a concept later termed cultural contamination. Second, it is clear that from the get-go, the Prime Directive contained inherent flexibility. Captains were afforded significant discretion in its enforcement. The Enterprise, on its 5-year deep space mission, operated far from Federation HQ, often necessitating Kirk's on-the-spot decisions. This is certainly one such instance. However, subsequent examples will show concerns about captains playing God existed before the Prime Directive's formal establishment. Like what you're hearing so far? Smash those like and subscribe buttons. So in terms of the evolution of the Prime Directive, while it was initially conceived to prevent cultural contamination, it expands to include a second element, non-interference in inter- and intraplanetary issues, particularly when dealing with non-Federation societies. Or basically, don't stick your nose into other people's shit without being asked. So what does the full Prime Directive say? While partial examples of the text appeared in resources including Star Trek Federation, the first 150 years, and the Star Trek Encyclopedia 4th edition, the complete wording of General Order 1 first appeared in the 2022 Star Trek Prodigy episode First Contact. I will summarize its key points now rather than read them to you, but the full text is available in the show notes. Section 1 addresses non-interference with pre-warp societies. It permits contact, as seen in numerous Starfleet Goes Undercover episodes, but strictly prohibits self-identification or mission disclosure, interference with planetary development, and references to other planets or sentient beings. The only exception is if cultural contamination has already occurred, in which Section 2 must be applied. Section 2 mandates extensive research on a society before engagement, even if cultural contamination has already occurred or the species possesses advanced technology. Once contact is made, Starfleet must respect the culture's traditions and refrain from interfering with their societal development. On paper, this policy offers clear benefits. History provides examples of civilizations decimated by more technologically advanced colonial powers seeking resources. We've seen the loss of languages and religions due to missionary efforts which inherently lacked respect for other people's beliefs. As stated earlier, the Vietnam War significantly influenced the Prime Directive, and we now know of the tragic loss of approximately 2 million Vietnamese civilians on both sides due to interference from technologically superior nations like the Soviet Union, China, and the United States. In the Trekkian context, non-interference is not isolationism, but a committed intention to do no harm. However, this points to an immediate problem. How can the Prime Directive coexist with Starfleet's mission to explore strange new worlds? Is this why so often, instead of being General Order 1, it's interpreted as General Guideline 1? Ultimately, this boils down for me into one question. Does Starfleet need a Prime Directive? And to begin exploring that, let's turn to an early episode of Star Trek Enterprise, the Season 1 episode Dear Doctor. I'll be honest, it's a rough episode to watch, and it's pretty divisive among fans. Plenty of people have critiqued it on its merits, and you can absolutely find reasons to be critical. But I want to hear from you. What do you think about Dear Doctor? Drop your thoughts in the comments. So instead of focusing on whether the episode is good or bad, I want to highlight something more interesting. All the ways this story grapples with the different aspects of what would later become the Prime Directive. Dear Doctor pulls together themes from Prime Directive episodes from across the Star Trek universe, the 5 shows and 9 films which preceded it. It shows how these moral and ethical dilemmas about non-interference, cultural contamination, and duty of care have evolved over time. With that in mind, let's dive into the episode itself. Dear Doctor revolves around a moral decision that ultimately falls on Captain Archer's shoulders. The crew encounters a ship belonging to the Valachians, a pre-warp society that have sent this ship out into space, desperately trying to find another civilization that might help them with a medical emergency on their planet. T'Pol, ever the voice of Vulcan logic on the Enterprise, points out that since the Valachians have already met other warp-capable species, the risk of cultural contamination is low. And while Starfleet does not yet have a Prime Directive, the Vulcans do have a non-interference policy, which T'Pol, true to form, reminds Archer of again and again throughout the series. The Enterprise sets course to Valakis to see if they can help cure what presents as a pandemic. Once they arrive, they discover something more complicated. The Valachians share their world with a second sentient humanoid species called the Mank, who don't seem to be affected by the disease at all. The Mank live as a sort of subclass. They aren't treated cruelly, exactly, but they're not given the same opportunities for learning and growing as the Valachians. The Valachians dismiss them as mentally inferior, but the crew quickly realizes that this isn't the case. The Mank are every bit as capable, they just are stuck in a cultural system that keeps them down. Then Dr. Phlox, the non-Starfleet Denobulan ship's doctor, makes the real discovery. The disease isn't a random outbreak, it's genetic. Left unchecked, it will wipe out the Valachians within 2 centuries. And to make things even more complicated, Phlox also discovers a cure, a fact he does not share with the Valachians. And here comes the dilemma. What should the Enterprise do? Remember, there's no Prime Directive yet. Archer is leaning on his crew for advice, but ultimately the call is his. The Valachians beg not just for the cure, but also for warp technology. With warp drive, they argue, they could reach more worlds, cast a wider net, and maybe save their people. So let's break down what's at stake here in terms of the Prime Directive. First, there's the issue of revealing themselves to a pre-warp society. Normally, that would be a violation, but since the Valachians have already met warp-capable species, this might technically slide under the caveats of Section 2. Still, Starfleet hasn't studied this culture at all, so they're flying in blind. So yeah, this is a violation. Second, this decision affects internal politics. Archer's decision isn't just about medicine, it's about the survival of one species over another. Save the Valachians, or step aside and let the Mank rise. Either way, the society of Valakis will be permanently altered, no matter what Archer decides. And third, technological contamination. 2 kinds of it. First, warp drive. The Valachians see it as their lifeline, but giving them this technology would launch them forward centuries in one leap. And just like Vulcans after first contact with humans, Archer refuses to give them advanced technology. Then there's the cure itself. Phlox argues that if Enterprise hadn't shown up, the Valachians would naturally die out and the Mank would eventually become the dominant species. He compares it to how Neanderthals disappeared and Homo sapiens became the dominant sentient species on Earth. You know, other than cetaceans, obviously. For Phlox, intervening would mean altering the evolutionary trajectory of an entire world. In fact, an earlier draft of the script, he states, I consider myself a man who values human compassion, but I find myself, in this case, a slave to Vulcan logic. Have I made the right decision? I suspect I'll be asking myself that question for years to come. Archer is furious at Phlox for his arguments. He points out that Phlox interferes with natural evolution every time he performs a medical intervention. But Phlox won't budge. To him, this isn't about individuals, it's about species-level destiny. In the end, Archer sides with Phlox, and you can tell the choice strips away some of Archer's idealism about boldly exploring strange new worlds. Regardless of how divisive it is, I generally appreciate this episode. It absolutely has flaws, and you should unquestionably debate whether Archer made the right call. But Dear Doctor really shows why I love Enterprise, that ongoing question of what does Starfleet look like before the Federation. The events of this episode take place before the Prime Directive exists, and Archer even alludes to this in his closing speech. Now, it might feel a little heavy-handed as a tie-in to the original series, but his words have always stuck with me. Someday, my people are going to come up with some sort of doctrine, something that tells us what we can and can't do out here, should and shouldn't do. But until somebody tells me that they've drafted a directive, I'm going to have to remind myself every day that we did not come out here to play God. This quote sums up the weight he's carrying. Messages to Starfleet in the Enterprise era can take days, even weeks to reach home. Archer doesn't have the luxury of waiting for orders. He has to make snap moral judgments. And it would be so easy for him, as he states, to play God. Sometimes Archer makes the right call, and sometimes he strands an Illyrian ship. But what you always see is the beginning of what makes him a Federation founder, and eventually its president. He wrestles with morality in every single situation, even if his humanity, or the lack of precedent, leads him into mistakes. For me, Dear Doctor is one of the clearest examples of what happens when you stick to the letter of the Prime Directive and take it to its extreme, namely being willing to let a sentient species go extinct. And that's what makes the Prime Directive too powerful. The episode, and Archer's journey, is hard to watch. It's uncomfortable, and it should be. Growth is uncomfortable, and that's exactly what's happening to Archer and his crew. And the ending lingers. We don't know if the Valachians survive. There's no Return of the Archons style follow-up, no USS Cerritos swooping in for Project Swingby. That silence, that not knowing, is part of what makes it so tragic. And what begs the question, is the Prime Directive even the ideal they should be living by? So what do you all think? Let me know. I want to turn now to the main ways, for me, that the Prime Directive violations can be categorized. Resources including our online Star Trek Bible, Memory Alpha, tend to break down violations based on whether the violation occurred in a society that either was or was not aware of other civilizations. I instead want to break down these violations based on their consequences. And, as is on brand for this channel, I want to do it from the perspective of politics, religion, and culture. I will also use these 4 categories in my next video, diving deeper into egregious Prime Directive violations. First, let's talk about the religious consequences of the Prime Directive. These are cases where Starfleet interference either permanently or nearly permanently alters a society's religion. A classic example is the 3rd season Next Generation episode, Who Watches the Watchers? Due to Federation and Starfleet influence, the Mintakans, a pre-warp Bronze Era society, almost have their religion and culture completely upended. Captain Picard manages to get things back on track, but the damage is done. The Mintakans now know there is life beyond their planet and that space travel is possible. Cultural contamination has occurred, and it will take generations to know if this leads to a positive or negative outcome. But one of my favorite examples, and one that really drives home the stakes, comes from Discovery's Season 5 episode Whistlespeak. The Discovery arrives on Halemno, a desert planet with only one inhabitable area. The survival of the Halemnites depends on weather towers secretly installed by the Denobulans. Yep, the same culture Dr. Phlox comes from. These towers are meant as an altruistic mission, and were hidden as mountains to avoid cultural interference. So at least the Denobulans tried. But the technology is failing, and the Halemnite survival is at risk. Here's where things get messy. The failing towers have already shaped Halemnite religion. The mountains become sacred, and the journey of the Mother Compere arises, a deadly ritual where the winner is sacrificed to appease the gods for rain. Enter Captain Burnham and Lieutenant Tilly. They participate in the journey as a means to secure the technology they need to fulfill their season-long Red Directive. Tilly wins alongside Rava, one of the Halemnites and daughter to their priest Ovaz. Burnham begs Ovaz to save Tilly and Rava. And this is Discovery's Prime Directive violation number 1, not respecting local customs. To prove they must be saved, Burnham reveals that she is from another world, violation number 2. Ovaz eventually capitulates, and then Dr. Culber beams in to save Rava, showing off both transporter technology and Starfleet medical equipment. Violation number 3. Ovaz's faith is completely shaken. Through Burnham's explanations, he realizes the sacrifices were based on a misunderstanding. The gods weren't angry, the weather towers were just failing. Burnham reassures him that their gods still exist, but the Hellemnites now know there's more to the universe than they thought. Ovaz pledges to try to end the sacrifices, and in this way, their religion is permanently altered, again by outside influence. So what are we on now, like 4 separate violations of the Prime Directive in the same episode? Let me know if I missed one. Whistlespeak perfectly illustrates religious violations of the Prime Directive. Belief systems can be irrevocably changed even with the best intentions. And like all Starfleet interference, it raises the question, was it worth it? Or should the crew have simply left the Hellemnites to their own fate? The second way I want to look at Prime Directive violations is through their impact on internal politics. Let's use the Voyager episode 30 Days as an example. Voyager discovers a planet entirely covered in water, created by an advanced species long ago. The Moneans, who settled it long after the species was gone, face a crisis. Their mining of oxygen is destabilizing the planet, and in 5 years, the planet will be uninhabitable. Lieutenant Tom Paris, ever the Maverick, takes it upon himself to help, without Captain Janeway's permission at first. He teams up with Riga, a Monean scientist, to investigate and presents their findings to Burkus, the deputy council member they've interacted with. Paris warns that if the mining doesn't stop, the planet will die, but Burkus, he's more concerned with political fallout than saving his own people. And that should be it. According to the Prime Directive, Voyager should leave and let the Moneans decide their own fate. Paris isn't happy. Janeway reminds him of their Prime Directive responsibilities, trying to balance morality with duty. But Paris can't just sit by. He recruits Riga to go with him to sabotage the refineries, forcing the Moneans to act. And chaos ensues. Burkus sends ships after the rogue shuttle. Janeway orders Paris back. Paris hangs up on her, and Voyager is forced to intervene carefully to prevent civilian casualties and infrastructure damage while simultaneously stopping Paris. In the end, Paris's plan is thwarted, but the political damage is done. Paris's actions are in direct opposition to Monean sovereignty. He's involved himself directly in planetary politics, and we don't know what the consequences of that will be long term. He has put his entire crew in danger of a military conflict. Relations with the Moneans are now strained, and Paris pays the price, a demotion and 30 days in the brig. This episode is a great snapshot of the challenges of a black and white interpretation of the Prime Directive. The directive strictly forbids Paris intervention, but without the intervention, an entire civilization could die. In the end, Monean culture survives, but for how long? The Moneans, unless they change their minds, have doomed themselves to killing their own planet. But that is their choice, and their right as a sovereign people. Finally, the episode also drives home another key point. The captain, not a lieutenant junior grade, is the ultimate arbiter of the directive, especially in the Delta Quadrant, where Starfleet is, at this point, out of reach. Morality, duty, and consequence collide, and the choices are never easy. The TNG Season 1 episode Too Short a Season exemplifies the third example of Prime Directive violations, namely interventions in intraplanetary conflicts. In this episode, a retired Starfleet officer, Admiral Mark Jameson, aka Dude in an Upgraded Pike Beep Boop Chair, aka Old-Ass Admiral McCoy's stunt double, is called upon to negotiate the release of Federation hostages on Mordan 4 at the request of Cardassia, the governor of the planet. However, his return to active duty is marred by the revelation of past actions that have lasting repercussions. Years earlier, during spats on Mordan 4, Jameson supplied weapons to Cardassia, at that time a faction leader in an intraplanetary conflict, to facilitate the release of civilian hostages taken as a bargaining chip to get said weapons from the Federation. This action, intended to resolve the immediate crisis, violated the Prime Directive by interfering in the internal affairs of a sovereign planet. In an attempt to be fair to both sides, Jameson provides arms to Cardassia's rivals, inadvertently igniting a prolonged civil war that lasted decades. Jameson justifies his actions, saying it was his, quote, interpretation of the Prime Directive. Let them solve their problems with those arms on an equal basis. And while both sides might now be equal, the damage was done. Instead of just the 63 hostages dying, millions died because of Jameson's actions. The sequence of events underscores the potential dangers of interference in the natural progression of a society's conflict. Jameson's solution in the episode comes as too little, too late. He attempts to broker peace to make up for his violation of the Prime Directive, but due to other health issues, he dies during the process. The episode shows the direct consequences in intervening in conflicts between societies. Sure, the Mordanite society was in a period of violence, but again, Mordan 4 is a sovereign planet and not part of the Federation. Jameson had other options to free the hostages, and even admits that this time around they should probably use force. Not sure I agree with that either, but, at least it's not a Prime Directive violation. Too Short a Season is a fantastic self-contained story that really drives home the importance of not interfering and the possible consequences of breaking that rule when different societies clash. Jameson made a god-level decision without understanding the real potential consequences, and as a result, millions died. I honestly can't argue that he even had the best intentions in this one. Unlike some of the previous examples, he just wasn't a great commander. Finally, I want to look at Prime Directive violations that lead to a complete political and social transformation of a society. There are many examples in the canon, but one of the strongest is Star Trek Prodigy's Season 1 episode, All the World's a Stage, which I'll be diving into more deeply next week. While classic original series episodes like A Piece of the Action, the Chicago Mobsters Planet, and Patterns of Force, the Nazi Planet, are great examples of Prime Directive-style stories, they technically predate General Order 1, so they don't fully qualify. A standout example of societal transformation as a consequence of the Prime Directive is Voyager's blink of an eye. What I love about this episode, and why it's perfect here, is that the violation of the Prime Directive isn't intentional, but it does show the consequences of Prime Directive violations vividly. Voyager arrives at a planet, becomes trapped in geosynchronous orbit, and causes an earthquake. From the planet's perspective, the ship appears as a new star in the sky, and combined with the awesome power of the earthquake, inspires religious reverence. The inhabitants abandon their old god Tahal and begin worshipping Voyager, whom they call Groundshaker. But the story quickly expands beyond religion, which is why I use the example here. Due to some wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff, time passes much more quickly on the planet than aboard Voyager. The crew observes the civilization evolve technologically in real time. Through their observations, they come to realize that the planet is starting to understand Voyager as a physical ship rather than a star. Captain Janeway, respecting the Prime Directive, chooses to avoid direct contact with the pre-warp society, though the crew continues to monitor developments. The Doctor is sent to the planet as he is immune to the rapid aging that would affect the rest of the crew, to try to gather data on how they might escape. 3 planet years later, the Doctor returns, reporting back that Voyager has become the focal point of the society. Science, art, invention, even children's toys revolve around it. The planet is now committed to a single goal, reaching Voyager. Eventually, they construct a 2-person ship capable of penetrating the timey-wimey stuff and make contact with Voyager. This allows Janeway to avoid breaking the Prime Directive, as the Society has already done it for her. Retz, the surviving crewman of the planetary vessel, played by the amazing Daniel Day Kim, learns what Voyager actually is, why they're stuck here, and agrees to help Voyager find a way to leave orbit. As time progresses, the planet's technological advancements continue. They develop warp capabilities and even antimatter weapons, initially using them defensively to shoot at Voyager to try to make the ongoing earthquake stop. Retz returns to his planet, explains what's going on, and within a year's time on the planet, they solve the issue. With Retz's guidance, they provide Voyager with the tools needed to leave orbit safely. By the end, the ship disappears in the blink of an eye, but the Society has irrevocably been changed. This episode illustrates how a Prime Directive violation doesn't have to be intentional to have profound societal consequences. Cultural contamination can completely reshape religion, politics, technology, and social priorities. At the same time, it shows that such change isn't inherently negative. The planet's civilization becomes curious, inventive, and cooperative. The society, from what we can tell, seems to be peaceful, and they grow into a capable, forward-thinking people. In short, the natural evolution of the planet is altered by this inadvertent Prime Directive violation, but it is not necessarily corrupted. So now that we have these 4 categories of Prime Directive violations, I want to move to the Prime Directive's most egregious failure, the prevention of human or humanoid rights violations. Another major way the Prime Directive fails, and in many ways betrays the Federation's ideals, is when it comes to atrocities. One of the clearest examples I can think of is the Bajor-Cardassia conflict in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and the Federation's non-involvement during the Cardassian occupation of Bajor. The early seasons of DS9 focused heavily on the aftermath of the occupation. Under the occupation, 15 million Bajorans died. Entire swaths of arable land were poisoned, the planet was strip-mined, and Bajorans, including children, were forced into labor camps. Plainly put, the Cardassian occupation of Bajor meets the UN's definition of genocide, which includes killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, and deliberately inflicting conditions designed to destroy a population. See the show notes for the UN text defining genocide if you're not familiar with it. And yet, like much of Earth's history, and I'm thinking the US involvement in World War II here, the Federation dragged its feet on engaging. Starfleet stayed bogged down in border skirmishes with Cardassia that went nowhere, showing up only after the 50-year occupation ended and Bajor formally requested help. Terok Nor, the former Cardassian station, becomes the Federation's Deep Space Nine outpost. DS9's importance as a station skyrockets with the discovery of the stable wormhole near Bajor, the gateway to the Gamma Quadrant. In the DS9 pilot Emissary, Picard gives Sisko his mission. Your job is to do everything, short of violating the Prime Directive, to make sure that Bajor is ready for entry into the Federation. This line perfectly encapsulates the challenge of Sisko's mission. He is expected to influence a society's natural evolution without actually breaking the Federation's core principle of non-interference. I mean, yeah, talk about influencing the trajectory of the Bajoran people and, deep involvement in the interplanetary affairs of 2 non-Federation members, Bajor and Cardassia, especially after its blatant non-interference quite probably made the occupation worse. Sound familiar? So here's the ethical headache. Would the occupation have been as catastrophic if the Prime Directive didn't exist? Was it right for the Federation to stand by while the Bajorans suffered, regardless of their Federation status? Or would early intervention have dragged the Federation into the same messy nation-building quagmire that has haunted Earth's history since the Cold War? Let me know what you think. So is the Prime Directive actually an effective policy, or is it just a nice idea that looks good on paper but fails in execution? Scholar Richard J. Peltz-Steele tackles the challenges of the Prime Directive in his 2003 article On a Wagon Train to Afghanistan, Limitations on Star Trek's Prime Directive. He breaks the problems of applying the Prime Directive down to 3 key points. First, the Prime Directive is not inviolable. To the contrary, the capacity to choose between obedience to the Prime Directive and violation of it in extraordinary circumstances is the very stuff of a heroic starship captain or of a great statesman. Second, the Prime Directive can be only an aspirational principle, never a rule of law. Third, and most importantly, the Prime Directive is a product of fiction, specifically utopian fiction. It comes from a world in which people explore principally for the sake of exploration, not for the accumulation of wealth or exploitation of resources. So yes, the Prime Directive is nearly impossible to uphold consistently. It gets broken all the time, and it's rooted in a fictional utopia. But does that mean it doesn't matter? Absolutely not. The spirit of the Prime Directive makes perfect sense, especially when you think about it in the context of Vietnam and settler colonialism. While the Federation does establish colonies, and I could do an entire video on why that maybe isn't the right word to use, they are not a settler colonial power. Humanity has, by this point, learned that taking land that is already inhabited by other people and imposing your culture on said people is wrong. A lot of modern states could stand to remember this lesson. Federation colonies are built on uninhabited planets, which keeps non-interference front and center. But let's get back to the real problem. The Prime Directive and Starfleet's mission to explore strange new worlds are impossible to reconcile. If you truly avoid interference, exploration would have to be much more limited. How many episodes across the series, and even some of the movies, wouldn't exist if Starfleet crews couldn't observe, document, or interact with pre-warp cultures in even subtle ways? We've seen in our own history the destruction of less technologically advanced societies, the loss of entire languages, and the erasure of cultures in the name of exploration and empire. The difference in the Federation, though, is that exploration is not about wealth or exploitation. As Pelsteel notes, the Federation exists in a post-scarcity, mostly post-currency society. Exploration is done simply for the sake of learning, and learning for learning's sake, that's a worthy goal for sure. I hope exploration is part of why you're here. So is the Prime Directive a sound policy, or is it fundamentally at odds with Starfleet's mission? Did I miss any categories of consequences of the Prime Directive? What are some of your favorite Prime Directive episodes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to hear what you have to say. In the coming weeks, I will take some of your comments and respond to them in my office hours videos, which serve as a companion piece to the lecture series. If you enjoyed what you learned here today, or if you just want to be a nice person, please like and subscribe. For updates, follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. If you'd like to support independent scholarship, join us on Patreon. For each level of support, there are bonus materials and content, including input on future month's short course topics, extended interview and bonus videos, private AMA hours, a Star Trek book club, and even one-time lecture requests. Links are in the notes. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey down a long road. I hope you enjoyed getting from there to here with me. Be well, y'all, and try not to botch the Prime Directive while you're out there.